What's up everybody, Scott here from Stringjoy Guitar Strings, and today I wanted to do a little bit of an educational video and just talk about all the different materials that are used in different types of guitar and instrument strings. Thought it might be helpful to kind of run through them. We're not going to be doing any sound tests on this video. We've done some on other videos in the past if you're curious to compare, 80-20 bronze and phosphor bronze or something like that. But for today I just wanted to provide a little bit of an educational thing. I'll be Professor Scott for the day. So with any guitar string, there are two different pieces of material that are happening, at least. You have a core wire, and then with a wound string, you wind around that core wire. Now, for plain strings that are unwound, those are basically going to be all the same. So that's made of high strength, high tensile, high carbon steel wire. It has to be really, really strong because if you're putting a 9 on your guitar, that's a 9/1000th of an inch string that you're trying to, tune up and sweat on and bend and play for many, many months and have it hold tune and not sound bad. So it's a really impressive type of wire that's used. Basically, this is a high carbon steel that's coated in tin. Very rarely you'll see some companies, especially European companies, that will not tin that wire. It'll look gold. That's because there's a layer of brass put around that steel to protect it. Typically tinning provides longer life, so when you see like the silver ones that you're probably used to, generally we think of that as a higher quality plain string than if they're gold and they're not tinned. Now, the one exception to this is with nylon guitar strings. So the monofilament that you see, they kind of look like plain strings. They're not wound or anything, but are used on classical guitar strings. These are kind of funny. So these are actually just fishing line. When I first got into string making, I was kind of looking at like the gauges of nylon guitar strings, and I saw it'd be like 28.2 and 30.3, and I was like, wow, they're really getting very granular in terms of the size of these classical guitar strings. But the more I looked into it, it ended up it's just 50, 60, and 80-pound fishing line, and that's just what it kind of translates to from a diameter perspective. Typically, these were gut strings in the past, but then in the 1940s, Andre Segovia kind of helped develop this new material of nylon into being used commonly as a classical guitar string. It didn't have the disadvantages of gut in that it didn't hold tuning and all that. Real quickly, we should talk about gut since we kind of mentioned it. So gut strings are kind of the OG original strings. The way that they would make these, usually they'd use like sheep or pig intestines. They quarter it. So they put it on a little machine that has two knives and kind of cuts it crossways, and that gives you all these little different strands. Now, to prepare those for winding, you have to braid those strands, soak them, and then hang them to stretch over a period of about a week. Every day you take them down, soak them, and then re-stretch them a little bit tighter. After that, they're strong enough to be wound. The problem with gut strings, and the reason they were pretty much replaced for classical guitar, is that they just don't really hold up in terms of tuning very well because it's a natural material. I mean, it's literally the flesh of a pig, right? So if things got cold or like humidity changed, this would really kind of mess things up and you'd lose a lot of tuning. Now, continuing with our classical guitar string side, and we'll be wrapping this up pretty shortly if you're not a classical player, the wound strings in classical strings are typically wrapped with silver-plated copper. This is why classical strings tend to corrode really, really fast, or really not corrode so much as just patina. They just kind of look a little bit gnarly because silver is just like dying to tarnish at all times. But that is the sound that became the norm in classical guitar, and so as many things happen musically, that just kind of continued. For these classical guitar strings, they may have in the past been used with like a gut core. These days it's more of a rope core. So it's like rope nylon that's then stretched out and then wound in that silver-plated copper winding. So generally, that's classical guitar strings. It's some combination of fishing line monofilament for the plain strings and then rope core and silver-plated copper wound strings, unless you're finding a super old set or one of the few companies that still makes gut, in which case you're using gut, as I outlined. So jumping back into electric and acoustic guitar strings, basically the steel string varieties of strings, we already talked about plains. Now, wound strings are where a lot of the art comes out in string making. You have that core, like I talked about, and the wrap wire that goes around it. The core itself is almost always steel. The real difference there is the shape of it. Typically, you see hexagonal core wire that's used these days. The advantage of that is that the wrap wire can grab and be anchored over the entire length of the string, so you don't get any slippage or dead strings. In the past, they used round core. We still use it for some of our strings, like our pure nickel Broadways. So that you would just use a round core, wind the wire, and you'd flatten a little piece of it at the end, the way they used to do for piano strings, and still do actually, so that the wire could stick somewhere. But when you do those, you have to kind of bend them before you cut them, or else that wrap wire can kind of turn into a slinky and fall off and sound really dead and gnarly. Now, when it comes to the differences between electric guitar strings and acoustic guitar strings, the biggest difference here is the wrap wire, because you're using generally the same general core wire for any of these strings. So for electric guitar, the most popular by far is nickel-plated steel. The old standard was pure nickel, and you still see a lot of pure nickel strings today. The reason this switch basically happened was that pure nickel is really, really expensive. So at some point in the 60s or early 70s, people figured out that you could use nickel-plated steel, still get a lot of that nickel sound and the kind of nickel resistance to corrosion, while at the same time cutting down on costs substantially. And nickel-plated steel is like 4 times cheaper as a wrap wire than pure nickel is. Tonally, the big difference is you get a little bit more brightness in nickel-plated steel because of that steel, whereas for pure nickel, you tend to get more of that kind of warmth. You get some spank at the top end, but generally it's a pretty scooped middle line. The kind of third most popular thing that I think you see in electric guitar is stainless steel. They're not super popular because they can get a little sticky when you're playing them. They're not super smooth, but they bring a really, really bright sort of clangy tonality to the electric guitar, and you do see them even more commonly in bass guitar because people do really like that clang. So after those sort of big three, you get into a number of other kind of more niche-y materials that some companies use for electric guitar strings and others don't. One of the more popular of those is alloy 52. This is another steel-nickel hybrid, but versus like nickel-plated steel, you're not plating the steel with nickel. You actually are making an alloy of the two together in 52-48% ratios. This has a little bit of a brighter character. I personally don't have a string with it right now, and it's just because I think it sounds really good dirty and less good clean, but we might find a way of counteracting that in the future. You'll also see Cobalt used. Only one company can make Cobalt strings as they own the patent to it. There are a lot of issues with Cobalt. I can encourage you to do your own research. I won't talk about them right here, but that make it a questionable alloy and not a material that I would use for guitar strings due to the way that it's being sourced presently globally. So those are kind of the big two that I see. Very rarely you will see like a silk and steel electric guitar string, but we'll talk about those next up when we talk about acoustic guitar strings. The other big thing that comes into play is the actual shape of the wrap wire. So typically when you see round wound strings, that's a round wrap wire. When you see semi-flat or ground wound strings, they're winding that string with a round wrap wire, but then grinding it down so it's kind of half polished. And then of course you'll also see flat wound strings for electric and bass. The way these are typically made, it's that same steel core wrapped usually in a regular round wound under wrap layer, and then over top you'll wrap a ribbon wire that's like flat stainless steel or occasionally flat pure nickel, and then polish that down and apply silk at both ends. It's a super labor intensive process. Makes a super smooth feeling string that some players tend to really like. Now, wrapping up with acoustic guitar string materials, the most popular two are phosphor bronze and 80-20 bronze. 80-20 bronze is actually brass, but it's usually called 80-20 bronze in the acoustic guitar string world. It's just what people started calling it many decades ago, and now that's what people are used to. Outside of that, you commonly see 85-15, which is just the same sort of general composition as 80-20 bronze or brass, but in a slightly different layer. So that tends to have a little bit of a warmer characteristic. I know one company calls those Prohibition bronze, which I think is kind of a cool name. D'Addario used to make those in the 90s. I think they were called Great American bronze, but then they stopped and you don't really see those very much anymore. After those sort of main three that you see, again, it gets kind of niche-y. You will see some companies make a silver-plated copper acoustic guitar string. This is the same material used in classical guitar strings. Typically, these are called like a Django Reinhardt set, as that's more similar to what he would have used. The other one that you will see is silk and steel. So silk and steel strings are pretty cool. What you do is you take a thinner steel core, you tie a loop it's not really actually silk, it's usually nylon, around, and then you wind over top of that. What that does is it enables that you can use a thinner steel core so you have it more comfortable and you get a lot of the strength of the nylon kind of accenting that steel core. You also get more dampening from a string like that, so it tends to have a little bit of a muddier kind of tonality, but it's a lot softer and easier to play, and silk and steel strings are a really great choice for beginners generally, as well as like old guitars where you don't want to have quite as much tension. That about covers it for acoustic guitar strings. Obviously you'll see some companies coating these same materials, just like we talked about earlier. And then very rarely I've seen things like a polished bronze for acoustic guitar, or even a flat wound acoustic guitar string. I got some flat wound acoustic strings once that were really neat. I didn't like the sound, but they were really fun to see. That was a company called Dogal in Europe that makes those, that are pretty rare. As with all things, there are even kind of weirder, nichier things. I know there was a company for a while called Red that was an imprint, I believe, of Cleartone's operation, where they would use pure copper, which is what's typically used in piano strings. I actually haven't been able to get my hands on a set of those. I'm kind of curious what they would sound like. The trouble with that, of course, would be early corrosion could certainly happen, but maybe they found a way around that. I'm not entirely sure. But those are generally, in general, the materials that you will see no matter how deep you go on electric, acoustic, or classical guitar strings. All of them, I think, have their own advantages and disadvantages. I'm sure we'll come up with more in the future. We've even experimented with some wire that I didn't list above. Nothing that we put out just yet, but it's pretty fun to play around and try out. So in the future, in 30 years, if you're watching this, there might be whole new categories of wrap wire and core wire that we're not using right now, which is pretty cool. What I love about this world is there's always innovation happening, and there's always new sounds coming out of things that people are building, and that will inspire players, and they'll make new and different sounding music than they would before. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful. I hope you know a lot more about guitar string materials than you did coming in. If you have any questions, as always, support@stringjoy.com is our staff. We're always here to help and advise on any of our strings or any weird sets or gauging or anything like that. So thanks for checking us out.